Now it does work. Welcome to this somewhat atypical lunchtime meeting. We are half an hour early with respect to our usual timing. And this is entirely appropriate for, I think, a first for SEPS, which is the presentation of an index, which we had the pleasure to prepare with Google. And it's an index of readiness for digital lifelong learning. And then subtitle is changing how Europeans upgrade their skills. I think we all agree that upgrading our digital skills is something which is decisive for Europe and its economy. I'm struggling with it every day, but I have here younger collaborators who are much more advanced than I am. And it's really a pleasure to do this because we also have other activities in the area of education and digital issues. We are running a network of educational economists for a European Commission framework project, where we are looking at different issues. And of course, learning, and digital learning is one of the key ingredients of any growth strategy. It was in the 2020 strategy, which is now being downplayed at the official level, but I'm sure it will come up again, and that is something which will preoccupy European policymakers for quite some time, and not least if one looks beyond Europe. Just back from a conference in London, we were discussing also the triangle Europe, China, US, right? And if Europe wants to count in any way in this geopolitical triangle, then I think upgrading our digital skills all over Europe will be one key element. So this is just to underline, I think, the importance of this topic. And I very much hope that this index will give policymakers at the national EU level, as one says, food for thought, and hopefully then reasons for action. And this is all I want to say at this point. I hand over the microphone to Maria, who will give you more background. Thank you very much.
Great. Should I stay here? Great. Thank you so much, Daniel, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I wanted to just do a quick introduction of Grow with Google, which is the project that we are running here in Europe and partner with SEPS to develop this research. Basically, Grow with Google comes from this vision that digital technology must empower people. We do believe that skills are a fundamental part of that. And Google needs to act responsibly in driving that mission and driving those skills uptake across Europe. We started back in 2015, actually, as part of the Digital Skills and Jobs Coalition pledges to train 1 million European in digital skills by 2016. And we saw huge demand for it. In a year, we trained over 1.6 million Europeans on digital skills. Now we're focusing a lot on how we enable that digital skills training in a way that actually drives some outcomes for the people that we train. We enable them to find a job, grow their business or career by 2020. So this is an initiative that we don't do alone. Obviously, we do with a range of partners. And we also have different flavors of it across Europe. We're also present in the Middle East, in Africa, other regions. But even in Europe here, you'll see that there's different perspectives of it and how it is implemented across the region. So for example, in Spain, we focus a lot on upskilling youth and tackling youth unemployment. In Italy, it's all about digitizing small, medium businesses. In Germany, Northern European countries, is how do we prepare the workforce for the jobs of the future. So very different flavors, but we do this, as I mentioned, with a range of partners, public, private partners. And one good example is the partnership we've done with the Minister of Industry and Labor in Italy, Crescere Digitale, which with EU funds enables us to upskill youth and also place them in internships that are covered by EU funds. So it's really important that we provide the content and we provide the digital skills. Our content ranges from basic digital skills such as using web, using your email, to more advanced such as coding, programming. So we have a very big range also with a set of partners. So far, we've trained 6 million in EU. Overall, in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, we're around 12 million people trained. But it's not also how much people we train, but also what do they get from it. So we run a big research in partnership with Ipsos Mori to understand how many people found jobs, grew their business, or advanced in their career after our trainings. And these are some of the impact rates we've seen. But we're continuously trying to understand how we can improve this and how we can help more people. So that's why researchers like this helps us shape and get a better understanding of what are the regional differences, what are the country landscapes, and how can we adapt our programs to be more impactful and be more helpful. This is kind of an overview of what we have across Europe. But I think more interesting is some of the stories. So, for example, in Spain, we've ran, one of the issues for coming out of the report, as you'll see, is around access in rural areas. And that's quite significant across all of Europe. So we have partnered with nonprofits to drive this program called Digitalizadas, which delivers free digital skills training to women in rural areas in Spain. So that's something which is part of our initiatives and something that, following this report, we'll look at scaling across other countries. One other concept that is quite interesting is this notion of lifelong learning, right? And just a few weeks back, we had a 93-year-old retired doctor coming in one of our Grow with Google hubs. We have these hubs across different places in Europe, and getting training on Google Ads, analytics, different types of content, but just shows how much people can be motivated despite their age. So it was really inspiring story and something to learn from. So today we're here because we want to learn more and we want to work with partners and with experts like SEPs to understand more. We have done these type of partnerships in the past. In 2018, we looked at Central and Eastern Europe and how digitization can become a growth engine for that region. And also taking some research now into understanding labor mobility across Europe at a hyper-regional level. But today we're here to understand how Europe can be ready for lifelong learning, and really looking forward to the results.
Sarah? I'll actually stand up if you don't mind. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here for this presentation. I'm Sara Baiocco, and I work as a researcher in the Jobs and Skills unit, and I contributed to the report, which we will present today together with my colleague Zachary Kilofer. We first start with the overall presentation of the index, and we explain what we mean by digital learning, and then we explain a bit more why we think that it's crucial for the future of work and life in Europe, and then we explain what is the rationale for developing a new index considering that other indicators exist, and then we explain what we included in the index and how the index works. So I think that after the opening remarks, we all got that digital learning is important, and it's also the fact that from which we departed to study this topic. Nonetheless, it's a recent phenomenon, a relatively recent phenomenon, and a comprehensive and widely agreed definition of digital learning is hard to find. So maybe it's worth to start by clarifying what it's not digital learning. First of all, it's not only about technological developments, and it's not only confined to what happens in schools and universities, so in formal institutions where learning happens. And then it's not only for digital skills. It is not only for learning the skills, and it is not, I mean, digital skills are important to undertake digital learning, but they are not sufficient. So these are all important components for the phenomenon, but the phenomenon is broader. So digital learning actually describes how these digital technologies are integrated in the pedagogy, in the pedagogical approach in schools and university, but beyond this. So considering lifelong learning really. So the learning activities that we undertake at the workplace, but also in daily life. In addition, it is crucial to develop digital skills, but also for any other relevant skills that will be needed in the future. We define digitalization of learning as the process by which skills acquisition, development, and recognition are being transformed by these digital technologies. As a result, digital learning is really any activity that either children or adults undertake with the aid of these technologies. So, getting ready for the future of work. Why digital learning can help with this? First of all, we notice that interaction with digital technologies is more and more important in all jobs. This is today, and this is expected to rise in the future. Then with digitalization, manual tasks and routinized tasks are going to be more and more automated, and this will increase further the demand for high-skilled jobs. And for this, there is a need to increase education and training provision. Finally, there will be a rapid and continuous change of job tasks because digitalization is actually ongoing and it's not it's characterized by uncertainty as any process of technological change. So nobody really knows what happens for sure in 50 years. So it is important that we are ready to adapt and to keep learning throughout our life. From what above, we understand that digital skills are important for the future generations, but also for people already in the labor market that were not trained in this. Up and reskilling is necessary, and lifelong learning similarly. But how can digital learning help? So for digital skills, it's easy to understand, it's intuitive. If we learn a subject using a computer, we automatically also learn how to use the computer. But for other skills, it's important, there are several ways through which digital technologies transform the process of learning, and the report goes a bit more into the details of this, but here I want just to quickly highlight few main points. First of all, it allows to learn remotely, almost in all locations, and with a highly flexible time schedule. So this is important because it gives us access to distance learning opportunities. So I'm in Brussels, but I can, complete a master's degree online in the US. And it is important the fact that I can do so according to my own schedule. This is important for adults. Adults tend to have much more complicated schedule than children, who are supposed just to be in schools and learn. So it is useful to have learning resources available at the time when we can engage in learning. Internet makes easier to share learning resources and to get feedback from others. In this way, digital learning increases connections among people and across subjects. This stimulates a collaboration and participation in learning that sometimes also lead to the formation of a community of practices online. If we think about online blogs or even social media in some cases, or websites. This gives value to the experience in addition to the theoretical knowledge of a subject, and it gives access to the untapped potential of uncodified knowledge. and it foster a multidisciplinary approach in all subjects. Digital technologies also change significantly how we show the skills that we acquire. It is possible to have validation of skills through online tests, and this increase the validation of new skills. But it's also possible to make education certificates available in digital forms, and thus easier to share and to show online. So it increased the visibility of the skills that one owns. So as a result, there are strong potential benefits of digital learning because digital technologies makes it possible to learn more, cheaper, and better. More because it is possible to start to teach and learn all subjects in new ways. So in the example of mathematics, it's an old subject, but you can, with the aid of computers, you can learn in different ways. And then it opens up to learn new subjects, as in the case of digital skills, and specifically, for example, coding, that is believed to become more and more important in the future. And then because it increases the choices that we have about what we learn, precisely for what I said about the opportunity to learn at distance and so on. It makes it possible to learn cheaper because it lowered the cost of production of education. The easy example is a book that doesn't need to be printed anymore, but also when you organize a class, for example, you don't need to find the location and so on and so forth. Then I promise not to use these words in the presentation, but it is cheaper because it makes education and training a non-rivalrous good, in the sense that when a class or a book is available online, everyone can access it without preventing the others to access it. Sometimes the cost can be decreased so far that many learning opportunities are also available free of charge online. It makes it possible to learn better because the teaching approach can be enriched by the digital technologies with the use of new tools, and because it allows personalized learning. Thanks to the collection of data through the digital technologies that are employed in learning and teaching, it is possible to assess the results of each process and to see what works best for each one, and then to adjust the approach to learning accordingly. This is why we think is important. Now, why developing an index? Indexes are normally an impactful way to communicate a research topic as complex as digital learning for the reasons that I've just described. Our aim is also to raise the attention of policymakers on the issue of digital learning, and sometimes when you have a synthetic measure to communicate your results, it's easier. It is by no way mean to say who wins and who loses in this ranking. It's more to identify the areas for each country's improvement and considering the comparison across countries to draw lessons from each other's experiences. What are the novelties of the index? As I said, there was no existing index focused specifically on this phenomenon. Then, when we developed the index, we really combined several elements and several data that are important for the phenomenon, but that need to be put together to give a picture of digital learning. So this combination is new, and we consider the skills level and the participation in learning, and then we consider the availability and use of digital learning resources. So we take into account for the infrastructural and technological part, but also for the attitudes of the people towards this these digital learning opportunities. And then, most importantly, we take into consideration the institutional background. So the policy and the institutions that are meant to be supportive for digital learning. This is actually the real value added of the index, and Zach will go into the details of this in a few seconds, because it takes into account the role of the governance. Now, why it's important to take into account the role of the governance when we talk about these complex issues? First of all, because it's possible actually to shape the path of technological developments according to the context of the country, and these institutions can do. To coordinate the diverse actors, as it's a complex phenomenon, it really involves different stakeholders, different agencies, different ministries at national level, and it is important to have a concerted view. And then because it is necessary that digitalization is embedded, that digital technologies are embedded in what it's already there, so the institutions for education and training that are available in the country. I'll leave it to Zach.
So thank you, Sarah, and Daniel and Maria for the introduction. My name is Zachary Killhofer. I'm an American researcher on loan in Belgium, and I work with Sarah, and I was a co-author of this report, and I'm in the Jobs and Skills unit. So we do a lot of work that pertains to education and skills development in Europe. So looking to the first slide, how does the index work? The question also means, how do you measure something like digital learning readiness, especially at lifelong level? And so we went through a lot of literature, we spoke with a lot of experts, and we decided on 3 pillars, which are here. And we'll get into each of these pillars in just a moment, but just as a precursor to that, we tried to focus on data that was suitable for our needs. That means that it has to cover the entire European Union or as close to that as possible. We looked at the most recent data available, and we also wanted to make sure that we're not looking at indicators that are so widely used and that are used in other indices. So we weren't super concerned, for example, with digital public services or average broadband speed and this sort of thing, because there's already nice indicators out there that measure this sort of thing. So let's dive into the first one here. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the ranking for just this pillar, by the way, and don't feel the need to write down all the numbers, because we'll get to the discussion of results shortly here. So for learning participation and outcomes, learning participation means more people are being educated for longer, and learning outcomes is an indicator of how effective this education is. And so these are pretty unanimously understood as important elements for digital learning readiness. And we build this indicator from existing data. So learning outcomes, this is based on pretty well-known benchmarks in standardized testing. And so we focused on the skills and the proficiencies that are most relevant for digital learning. So we look at math, we look at numeracy, we looked at problem solving in a technology-rich environment, for example. You can see that composes 15% of the index. And on the next point, we look at, so this was, for learning outcomes. For educational attainment and participation, we look at the population that has attained tertiary education. And then for participation in lifelong learning, we considered 2 elements. One of them is for your adult population, how many or what % of this adult population has had some kind of ongoing training in the past 4 weeks. Then we also looked at the intensity of this. So we looked at the number of hours per capita that is spent on lifelong learning as an adult per country. So looking at institutions and policies, I think that this is the one that we have the most sort of value added compared to existing research here, because this is where we had to find our own data because the data was not out there yet. So why institutions and policies? And the reason is that digitalization of learning is very complex and it requires many different actors. And so to produce systemic change, you need a very well coordinated policy. You need to ensure coherence across a lot of different actors and dimensions. So to give you just a concrete example, you could imagine a country that invests a bunch of money and ensures that you have 1 computer per child for primary school students. But then you could also assume that perhaps they didn't take the time to ensure that teachers know how to teach using these computers. And this is something that we've actually seen in a number of countries around the world, right? And so you can have one or the other, but you need to have both in order to ensure that you have an effective policy at the end of the day. Otherwise, you risk losing a lot of money and not getting the outcome that you're after. So it can lead to a lot of waste as well as just not being effective. So anyway, we found out that we were interested in data which didn't exist, and so we decided to develop a survey with the help of, well, in-house experts, but also we consulted a few external experts in digital learning for Europe. So we attempted to minimize subjectivity for this survey, and we considered this all very carefully, and we ended up asking questions that we felt were the most indicative of digital learning readiness. On the institutions and policies, we were asking about the awareness of policymakers on digital learning. We asked if a government has a specific policy, if it has published priorities for digital learning and digital education, is the responsibility for implementing these policies clear, and so on and so forth. For regulation and funding, we were asking experts if the regulatory and funding frameworks are neutral, beneficial, or harmful for all different levels. Again, from primary, secondary, tertiary, as well as adult education. For educators in schools, we asked experts to assess the skills of educators and the availability of resources to educators in schools of all levels. So this means not only your average primary school teacher in country X, are they able to teach? That's one consideration, but another consideration is there an incentive for them to have ongoing training to continue to grow that skill and to learn new ways of teaching, to implement new technologies in their teaching curricula? For governance and implementation, this was 5%. This is the only part of Pillar B or Pillar 2 where we did not make our own data. This came from the World Bank and Bertelsmann Stiftung. And so this was essentially trying to say how effective overall is the central government for coordinating policy, how effective is the government, period. So for availability and use. We were interested in, well, availability and usage, but also attitudes in this pillar. So for this, we looked to survey data from Eurobarometer. We looked at questions asking people questions like, how do you feel digital technology is impacting society? How do you feel digital technology is impacting the economy, your job chances? How do you feel about robots and artificial intelligence? And so we asked, or this data is asking them sort of on a scale of very unfavorably to very favorably, what their attitude towards different facets of digitalization is. For accessibility of digital learning, we looked at one or two standard indicators. So the percentage of households that have internet access, which is fairly important if you're interested in digital learning. But we looked even more specifically at indicators that are more tuned towards digital learning as we understand it. We looked at, for example, how many people are consulting Wikipedia via the internet, how many people are using the internet to take an online course or to search for an online course. And we're also looking at the number of people who have either basic or above average basic skills. And once again, the rankings for this pillar are here. So that's what we did with the index, and that's how we constructed it. That's sort of the 5, maybe 8-minute version of what we did with this. And so now we'll talk about the results after we brought in the data and we did some economist stuff. Myself, I'm actually a political scientist, so I let the economists take care of their stuff. So the overall index findings. We had some things which were within our expectations, and we had some which were definitely surprises. So in many indexes of Europe, you're going to see northern countries do better, they tend to be wealthier, and so on and so forth. You see some of that. You can see that Sweden and Finland, the Netherlands are doing quite well, but we also see some things which we would not typically see in a Europe-wide index. One of them I'd like to point out is that bigger countries tend to struggle. And so by this I mean looking to France, looking to Germany, looking to Italy. These contain a massive portion of the population, looking also to Poland. The bigger countries are struggling in the overall index. And we also see that smaller and especially newer EU countries are doing disproportionately well compared to what we might expect. And so when we looked at the results from our individual national experts, one thing that we found, which I thought was quite interesting and perhaps quite encouraging, is that newer EU member states seem to be benefiting from access to EU assistance and to EU funding for improving their education systems and for sort of implementing new digital technologies throughout their education system. So this is perhaps one modest explanation for a bit of what we're seeing here. Let's look to the leaders. So if you're familiar with Estonia, you know that it is the leader of all things digital. We actually had a Estonian expert. We needed them to sign a form because we're in Belgium and we really appreciate paper and signing things and mailing them around here. The Estonian expert was not sure how to handle that because they sign everything digitally. If you want to vote in Estonia, if you want to pay your taxes and so on and so forth, it's probably done digitally in Estonia. And so there's this is somewhat expected. The Netherlands is known for having excellent educational institutions all around. Finland, if we look at the educational outcomes and participation, they are leading the EU, period. Luxembourg is leading in attitudes and in access to digital technologies, to digital learning. And Malta may not be a country you expect to see at number 5, but that's okay. They actually have been leaders in digital education for a couple of decades now. And we also see that some of their newer programs seem to be benefiting from EU assistance as well. But I do want to note something here. The leaders are not without their own troubles. So Luxembourg is obviously a very wealthy country. It's got the highest GDP per capita in the EU. It is 24th in learning outcomes. So if you look at just the proficiency in math and in science and reading and so on, 24th out of the EU, which is quite surprising. And so you can also see that learning outcomes, Estonia is also not doing well. This is just to say that if you're a leader, like that's wonderful and all, but it doesn't mean that across the board that you are succeeding. It means that this is, of course, the composite result. So the leaders are not leading everywhere, and even the leaders have a lot of room to grow. So before I get on to the stragglers, I wanted to highlight something else that came out from the surveys, which was quite interesting. We asked individual experts, tell us about innovative practices, tell us about proven practices in your country, something that's worked out, that's spread, that Europe can learn from. And so this is one nice example that I wanted to highlight here. It's called Mathematic. So this is in Luxembourg. It's the result of collaboration between a company called Vreta and Luxembourg's Ministry of Education, Children and Youth. But so this is a really great example of why digital learning is not just making sure that schools and children have computers. You can actually go online yourself if you just Google Mathematic and check it out. You can play a few examples. You can test yourself on primary and secondary mathematics in this gamified way. It's really quite fun. And it's also effective, but more importantly, it allows you to customize the way of learning. It allows you to get data about your students, which can be used for the teachers, for the parents, and for the overall education system. Getting good data on your learning processes is absolutely essential. And this is a way that you can make math more accessible to people. So you can do it from home, from the classroom, and so on. But moving on to the stragglers. So these are the ones from number 23 to 27. And we, of course, see that Germany is in last place, which is not something that happens very typically in a European index. And so let's talk about this briefly. When researchers get a result that is surprising, you tend to try to understand and verify what just happened, and we've done that. We've spoken with a number of German experts, and what we've managed to do is confirm that Germany is really struggling across the board in digital learning. And so to give you an idea, there was a nice article in the Frankfurter Allgemein from, I think, March of this year. They asked the educators. So I don't know if you recall, in Pillar B, which was for how good are the educators, how good is the school system, et cetera. Anyway, this survey looked and asked the educators, how do you feel about digital learning? How well is the country doing? 95% of the teachers think that Germany's schools are internationally far behind in digitalization. 90% think that Germany's plan to invest 5 billion euros in digital learning over the next 5 years is going to fall flat and be completely insufficient to affect the change that is needed in Germany. And less than 50% of teachers in Germany regularly use PCs as a part of their teaching. So these are a bit surprising, but of course, if you are more versed in where Germany is strong and where Germany needs perhaps to improve, then perhaps not completely shocking.
I'm a product of the German educational system. I can testify to the validity of this.
And so, again, Germany is one of these countries where it's not doing poorly if you look at something like standardized test scores. But if you go into the schools and you try to understand what is digital learning like, not the standardized test scores, what is digital learning like? The story is not a positive one. But again, you can also see that there's some variation here. Most countries that are on the stragglers list, they're not doing uniformly poorly. In fact, they're doing very well in a couple areas. And so Czech Republic, very high learning outcome scores, same for Germany, same for Italy, doing very well if you want to look at the sort of older means of education and how we assess that. These standardized test scores, these countries are doing pretty well. It just means that in the sort of newer education that we're interested in, they're struggling to adapt. So let's look at a couple of maybe trends or observations and conclusions here. The first note here is that yesterday's tech leaders are being passed. I think Daniel had a nice quote about the powerful industry or the old industry of Germany and Italy, which is not translating to success in the realm of digital learning as we're finding it. We find that the largest EU countries are not performing very well. And there's a lot of possible explanation for this, right? Part of this is the question of how centralized versus decentralized something is. And so you might have perhaps more experimentation allowed if things are more decentralized, but then you can't have a coherent implementation of an ambitious plan. And also you can't save on this cheaper learning, as my colleague Sarah was saying. You don't have the economy of scale that is such an advantage. We also think, well, we see that there's some correlation between how rich a country is and how well they do on this index, but it's not linear by any means. So Belgium and Ireland, they show that money does not translate to success in the Digital Learning Index, for example. Now, as for moving forward, this is quite an open question, how we can affect systemic change. One of these that's very important too is how do we change attitudes? You look at France and Germany. If you were to ask your average French or German person, how do they feel about digitalization? They're not feeling very positive about it. If you go to Germany and you try to pay for something with a card, they're probably going to say that we only accept cash in here, and I don't know what this electronic payment system is all about, right? And we also find that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, which is to say that countries need to improve, but they need to improve in their own areas. There's nothing that we can really say as a generalization about how we can fix the situation or improve the situation across all countries. And the other thing is that all things digital change very fast. So even the leaders of today cannot afford to stay put. And so I'll let Sarah take back over.
Thank you, Zach. Lots of facts, lots of information, but hold on for a few minutes because we actually miss one important part. Where does the EU fit in? So in all this, we saw like a diverse picture across Europe, and we also saw that different countries do good in something, and while others do better in other aspects. So let's start the discussion about the EU action, saying that the role of the European Union in the field of education and training is a role of coordination and support and complementing the actions that are undertaken at the level of member states. There is also the industrial development aspect of the thing, because actually digital learning includes the development of digital technologies, which is an issue that has to do with industrial development. Why the topic is important for the EU? Because it could actually contribute significantly to the European objectives and to the EU strategies. First of all, on digital issues, so to develop digital skills of the population and for the development of the digital industry, according to the digital agenda and to the digital single market strategy. And then broader than this, because it could have a positive impact on adult learning participation. The target for 2020 is 15%. Europe is still, the European average is still way behind this. So it could actually increase opportunities for learning for adults. And then it could also contribute to an objective of inclusion, that is to make access access to education and training universal, as it was recently remarked in the European Pillar of Social Rights. Accordingly, we found that the topic is of high relevance at EU level, and that is actually expected to grow in importance, as the President-elected von der Leyen mentioned in her program. The digital learning will grow in importance. There are actually several actions in place, and there are also European funds that are available for digital learning. I would like to point out mainly to two. No, it was this one. To two initiatives. So the first one is the overarching policy framework for digital learning in the European Union, that is the Digital Education Plan. This represents, of course, this is not the only document that talks about digital learning in the EU. There are many others, but this one is the first one that has actually a specific focus on this topic, and it's a comprehensive policy in the sense that it encompasses all the aspects that we are mentioning today. It has a lifelong learning perspective, so it considers education at all stages in life. It has an holistic approach, so it takes into consideration the infrastructure and technology aspect of digital learning, as well as the organizations and institutions' role, and also the skills and competencies both of the learners and the teachers. This is not a case. This document actually results from a strongly concerted and coordinated process that involved several DGs of the European Commission and consultation with stakeholders and member states. The plan has three priorities. One is to improve the integration of digital technology in teaching and learning, so always merging this aspect of technology with what exists at the level of pedagogical approach, then developing digital competencies and skills for the digital transformation, both in education and beyond for the labor market. And as I said, digitalization is ongoing. The impact of digital learning in the sense establishing what works best, what works a bit less is not clear yet. So another important priority is to increase research and data analysis, also through foresight, to actually improve the knowledge about the process of transformation of education and its impact in the society and in the labor market. The plan is implemented in 11 actions. But I would like to focus on this one because this appears quite innovative, because it is actually a tool that is delivered to the users, which is an uncommon policy tools if you think about the normal initiatives of the European Union. Selfie is the self-reflection tool and mentoring scheme for schools. Is an online tool available to primary, secondary, and vocational schools to assess their capacity, to self-assess their capacity to integrate digital technologies in teaching and learning. The tool allows teachers, students, and also the school personnel to answer a questionnaire that can be tailored to the characteristics of the context and of the school itself. So to take into account really the background. The background context. These questionnaires result in a tailor-made report which highlights strengths and weaknesses of the single institution that undertake this self-assessment, and this can serve as a basis for an action to develop further digital learning in the school. This is available open source online. This tool actually builds on another crucial initiative at European level, that are the digital competencies frameworks. So we keep talking about digital skills, but it's hard to assess and to develop these skills if we are not clear about what these skills are. Is it turning on a computer? Is it using a mobile phone? What is it? And how do you define what is your, how well you master these skills? Well, the competencies digital competence frameworks respond to this necessity to define better these skills. In the last years, three actually more, but three are more relevant for digital learning. These three frameworks have been developed to provide a conceptual understanding of digital skills as well as proficiency levels of mastery, also providing with practical examples in working life and real life to really understand what we talk about when we mention digital skills. And this facilitate the assessment of digital skills and also programs to develop these skills, because you have better in mind what are the objectives, what you are heading at. So the three frameworks are Digital Com 2.1. This is at individual level, so it describes the digital skills for individuals, so it's relevant for everyone, and it's a good tool to self-assess the level of digital skills. It has been actually integrated also in the Europass CV format. Then there is the second one, DigiComp Edu, and this one is for educators. So it takes into consideration what skills are needed for educators in a digital learning era. So it is necessary to blend the digital skills with other teaching skills. So this framework develop areas of competencies that are relevant for the profession of teachers, and also develop similarly proficiency levels of these skills. Then there is the third one that, if we may say, it's the broader one because it's for organizations and institutions, and it takes into account the pedagogical, technological, and organizational dimensions of digital learning to assess strategies at organizational level, so for example for schools, as it is implemented with Selfie, or policies at state level. Okay. Now, looking at this action, what is the value added that the European Union can deliver on this topic? First of all, as a supranational organization, it can set the agenda and provide guidance to member states on this topic, so having a strategic vision on the topic. Second, it can provide policy frameworks and tools like comprehensive policy frameworks like the Digital Education Action Plan, but also more practical tools like the self-assessment tools that can be used by users directly. For this, a comprehensive and coherent vision is needed. Too often when we talk about digital learning, we get only the digital skills perspective or only the industry perspective or only the school's perspective. So it's really good to have a concerted process to develop this coherent vision. Then the value added, we saw how the member states differ in terms of their results and their results in the single components of the index. So there is actually quite enough room quite enough room for improvement for all the states, also those that are leading, as Zach was explaining. So the European Union can actually enhance cooperation among member states for mutual learning in the aspects when each other struggles or does better, and to exchange best practices and lessons. Furthermore, it has a role to establish a common playing ground for industry. Having this common and clear playground could actually help industry developments in this field. And finally, as I said before, it's important to foster research on the topic to understand better what works and what does work less. For this, of course, streamlining funding is desirable to assess better the results of these funds and mapping what are the experiences that are undertaken. So this was it. I thank you for your attention, and I'll leave the floor to the discussion.
Thanks a lot. I think you had to absorb a very large amount of information analysis. If you still have time and inclination to ask questions, it's always difficult to get it started. Yeah, on the left. And if you could please identify yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very good and hard work, I can imagine. I'm Rikena from the Lifelong Learning Platform. So we are a network of networks of education and training providers. And we had in 2017 our theme was digital learning indeed. And we had a position paper. One of the recommendations that came out of that position paper, which was elaborated with a few researchers, was that for digital learning to happen, there is a major need on basic skills. And I don't know how much you digged into this issue of the actual basic skills needed to access or further enhance digital learning, if you understand what I mean. You kind of touched upon a bit, like numeracy, but how far did you go in that? Thank you.
No, thank you for the question. I think it is very important. As we said, it was a part of the calculation of the index. And so part of the standardized test scores we looked at were assessing primary and secondary school pupils. And so we were very interested in numeracy and reading comprehension, as well as one's more specific problem solving in a tech-rich environment. And so we completely acknowledge that these are foundational elements to think about when you think about digital lifelong learning. If you don't have these basic, more traditional skills, then it's hardly helpful if you have an additional tool available to you. And so again, I think that's the understanding that we have, is that it's not an inherent good if you simply have a computer in a classroom, right? I mean, if the classroom is not functioning well, if the teacher isn't improving their education using that computer, that's not what we're interested in. But certainly we think that there are examples where implementing digital technology can improve these basic skills. And the example from Luxembourg did look at that. I don't know if my colleague wanted to add on to that, perhaps.
You mentioned already that they were included in the first pillar. Okay.
Maybe I would just add something. So one of the things that we've seen actually is one of the main challenges. So you talked a lot about schools and the traditional ecosystem, and there's also basic digital skills challenges for adults, right? So what we've seen is there's a massive barrier thinking about, so how do you reach those adults, right, if they don't use digital in the first place. So one of the strategies that we've tried to implement is try to go and build these hubs that I showed in regional areas, which have a massive uptake of people just coming in the street and trying to get. So I think there's a mix of how can you complement with some of the offline components and some of the partnerships that you can have with regional bodies to implement some of those basic digital skills offline as well.
Thank you. So my name's Helen Hoffman. I'm in DG Employment in the VET Apprenticeships and Adult Learning Unit. In that context, I coordinate the work of a working group on vocational training. It's one of the 7 under the ET 2020 strategy, where we specifically look at the role of innovation and digitalization to facilitate high quality VET. And my question is about the, positive and bold statement that digital learning makes it easier to have more better and cheaper learning. And now whilst I see, of course, a lot of arguments why this can be the case, and we also see with the results that it's some of the maybe smaller countries that may have sometimes fewer resources that are doing better compared to bigger ones. At the same time, I see time and time again this discussion, yes, that it can maybe reduce social inequalities, maybe it can produce more equity, but it also takes time to implement such a policy. You also need to, certainly if I look at vet schools or even general education schools, it's a question of which aspects to pick for digital learning. There's such a wealth of different tools out there. yeah, it takes time to select this. Who does the selection? This can also cost money. So sometimes this discussion of equity, social inclusion, does it really cost less, isn't always so clear to me. So I would be more interested to hear from you on those aspects, what you think the, let's say, preconditions are, or necessary success factors in this area.
I'll just touch on the first part that you mentioned. The first part you mentioned was the statement that digital learning can make things more, better, cheaper. I think that, of course, this is a generality, and we even sort of address the inherent asterisk that's next to this statement, which is that more technology does not immediately get you any of that, right? It requires a very well thought out policy, requires coherent policy and coordination. And there's a really great body of literature that does look to this question: do you have better outcomes in schools if you simply put tablets into the hands of teachers and students, if you increase the number of computers and so on? There's very interesting evidence that is quite mixed, right? But what I take from that is that it absolutely does not guarantee better educational results if you simply introduce technology into the traditional ecosystem. But I think that, or at least for me, I would absolutely stand by the idea that properly used, digital technology does increase the amount, the maximum potential amount of education you have. It certainly makes things cheaper. That's, I mean, after the initial investment, it has a great scaling effect. And I also think that we see very specific instances where the educational quality is better. And part of this is not just because, I don't know, I learn maths better because I have a computer, right? But part of this is because at the systemic level, when you implement digital technologies, you're able to generate data from this and to figure out what's lacking, to figure out what school district or region or city is lacking, which teachers are underperforming, and then you can make better policy afterward. Once you have the data, it allows you to understand much better than any non-systematized version of that. But I wanted to pass to Sarah after that. I forgot what the second part of the question was, but Sarah probably didn't.
Yeah, thanks for pointing out this, because it gives me the possibility to add a nuance. Actually, the initial investment is needed, like this is for sure. But once the investment is done, then the outreach of the training, the vocational training possibilities and opportunities that digital learning opens are way better than organizing vocational courses I mean, physically. So this is one point. Yes, it's true. The initial investment is needed, and it should be taken into account. What works and what does not work, and what are the factors that lead to success? I think that this is exactly where research is needed, in the sense that. As Zach was saying about the impact of digital technologies in one subject, in another subject, in one context rather than in another, are still very mixed in the literature. And this is also why coordination is needed to understand what works and what doesn't work. Because if these innovation islands remain detached from each other, it's hard to exchange a lesson learned and to understand what are the factors of results. So this is definitely, and I mean even more on vocational training is a relevant body of research to undertake.
Okay, yeah, another question. So, if you allow me, okay, thank you. So, my name is Yves Puny. I'm also from the European Commission, from the Joint Research Centers. And actually, we've been working for many, many years already also on digital learning. And you also have been interviewing myself and the team. And actually, we are the ones who developed the DIGCOMP, the DIGCOMP Edu, the Selfie, together with the colleagues from DG Employment and DG EAC. So, we're very pleased also to see that in your report. First of all, may I congratulate you for this report, because actually I remember when you contacted me 6 or 9 months ago and you explained me the ambition of this project, I was thinking, okay, good luck, Zachary, mission impossible. You will never ever get a report out by the end of the year. And you did. So really congratulations for that. So because that is really what I thought at that moment. So really great work, and I think also very useful work. Of course, a couple of questions related to that. First of all, obviously an index is interesting, but then it begs the question, do you have any plan to repeat it, to do it next year and the year after? Because then, of course, an index becomes much more interesting when you see progress. when you see movement. So that's just to think about. I don't know if you have any plans to continue working on that. Then another question actually relates also a bit, comes back to what Google was also saying before, is maybe a challenge for this kind of index at national level, is that we also know from data actually that there within countries, within member states, there are quite a number of regional differences. And exactly last week, the ISILS study came out, Information and Computer Literacy study, and they made the point very, very clearly that within the countries, there are huge differences between regions in terms of, you know, ICT literacy. So that's also maybe a bit of a challenge there. And then a bit of a technical question which I have on the construction of the index, because you know there is the digital skills indicator based on the DISI. So it was not clear to me if did you actually use the DISI indicator to calculate the digital skills, because you know we have the DISI indicator which says we have about 42% of the European population has very low or insufficient digital skills. So these are the Eurostat household survey data. So did you take them into account or not in the end for the construction? And if not, then obviously why not would be the question. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that statement at the beginning. I'll answer the second question, and then for the first and third, I'll pass off to my colleague, who I think is better at answering this. For the second question, of course, one thing we did consider is well, the difference in regional competences. Of course, in many of the larger countries, especially in the federal systems, education is largely left to the regional or local level, and that impacts and has huge differences between regions. The way that we constructed the index, I don't think it could be immediately transferred to this, and the reason is because we don't have, well, most of the data that we have, we're lucky if we have it at national level, much less the sub-regional level, and so, and much less if we have it available at a annual basis. I think the most recent data that we used was from the end of 2018. In a few cases, we had to look at 2016 data because it just doesn't come up as annually as others. So I think that it is possible to construct an index with, I guess, a similar, foundational idea as this. It would just need to be, the details would have to be quite different. And I'll pass off to Sarah. Thank you.
We've been doing some work, of course, on countries like Italy, where there's a large variation, also in education outcomes. A similar variation existed in Germany. And then after some time, I think the German lenders decided that they didn't want to embarrass each other, and the data is no longer published at this regional level. In Belgium, I think it still is, right? So you have some regions where some countries, sorry, where some of the regional data is available, but as you can see, sometimes the regional authorities get so embarrassed that they don't want to have this data published.
Okay, data on digital skills. We use this, we actually use, we didn't use DESI components, but the source of data that are in the index are also, some of them are also using the DESI. So this is the case for digital skills. Yes. Repeating the index, that would be great. Of course, we would like to repeat this. I also think that this kind of indices makes sense once you repeat for a number of years, you refine the methodology, you also see a little bit of evolution, maybe not every year, because there is such a strong institutional component that it's hard to say, to see a change from one year to another. But yes, we are definitely interested in repeating this.
I would just add one little point there. For practical reasons with data availability, one of our kind of more interesting ideas was not possible to implement with this iteration. So part of digital learning is, of course, just how many people are actually learning at home. And one thing we wanted to have data on was how many people are using apps on their cell phones, so from the Android store, from the Apple App Store, to learn. And so there's some literature about this. We know that Duolingo, which is a language learning app, this is very big in Sweden, for example, especially among the refugee population. There's some really interesting points here about the utility of digital learning apps that are just widely accessible on your cell phone. So we wanted to say, well, we assumed that a country is going to have more readiness for digital learning if more people are already doing it, right? In the end, we weren't able to incorporate this, but this would ideally be something that we could include in the third pillar, which is about your attitudes and availability. So we do think that there's of course room to improve a little bit, but of course, if we revisit this in the next year, or perhaps every 2 years or so, then I think it would generate a lot of interesting insights, and of course the trajectory and who's on the rise and who's not. That could be a very interesting story to tell.
In the interest of geographical diversity, we'll first take a question from there, and then we come back to the second row.
Thank you. My name is Monica. I'm from the European Student Union, so representing the learner's perspective. And I'm going to ask one slightly critical question about your future efforts, because how are you incorporating the aspect of quality in learning? I think this is something that is vastly underexplored when it comes to digital learning, how you actually ensure the quality of this type of learning. Because oftentimes when we make this type of projects, we all fall into the trap of just promoting it for the sake of promoting it and making statements that it will automatically be more of it, cheaper of it, and better of it if it's just digital. But we all know that that would not automatically happen, and it has a lot to do with the quality we put into the learning. And the reason that this is a kind of a critical question for your future efforts is you're trying to measure attitudes. But if there is one thing that can destroy the attitude towards digital learning for a learner, it's exposure to poor quality digital learning. So when we have an increasing level of exposure to poor quality digital learning in our institutions, where students are experiencing that it's done for cost-saving reasons and actually decreasing interaction with teachers, then they don't come out as people who perceive digitalization as something that is going to help them be lifelong learners afterwards. So do you have any plans in mind on how to quality assure digital learning and how to help it being implemented, not for the sake of it, but for the sake of quality?
No, I think that's a really completely fair question, and we do not start from the assumption that adding digital makes things better, cheaper, more. But of course, we do argue that it's the possibility. But so, for example, you made me think of some horror stories that I knew from back in my bachelor's degree, which is where, for example, you would have some online portal where you need to submit your homework, and so I don't know if the answer is 3.14. I might type that in exactly correctly, and it says, "I'm sorry, the answer was 3.14," and I get the question wrong, and then you're shaking your head at the computer. I mean, digital learning is not an inherently positive experience, and I've maybe experienced some of what you're discussing there as well. So I completely empathize. But we do still insist that it's that the potential is there, and that properly executed, it can still improve outcomes. It can improve experiences for students. We have lots of examples of where student life, student learning is improved. But one other thing about the notion of what is better, it's of course a bit subjective, what makes learning better or not, and we try to answer this in economist ways. So I mean, if it improves your standardized test scores, then it must have been better learning. But what we felt was necessary here is just to go into the country to find a digital learning expert and to ask them, what is the quality? How do you assess the quality of learning at all these different levels? And we asked them to do this in a number of different ways. We asked them, if I'm a primary school teacher, must I have digital competences? Must I have taken any courses to teach about digital skills? Do I have any funding or time off of my work where I can go and learn more about this on a certain period? And the answers, they varied widely across countries, right? But of course, we did our best to try to show what better is, as far as you can put a number on better. But no, I think your point is well taken, that you need to be very careful, and you absolutely cannot, if you walk out of this, the assessment or your takeaway from this should not be that digital all the way and that immediately this is just the best investment and it's automatic improvements. That is not the takeaway from this. But we do hope that you're a bit more aware and conscientious of the systemic needs and of what can improve at systemic level.
Sorry, there's a lot of people in the second row. Hi, I'm Deirdre. I work in the digital education team in DG Education and Culture. So like Eve, I just want to thank you for the report. I think it helps increase all of our understanding about this very complex and ambitious field, which is digital learning. And I mean, well done for taking on such a vast topic, and we really appreciate that you've looked at the really important area of digital skills and all its complexity. There's a lot behind the term digital skills, meaning the confident, creative use of and responsible use of digital technologies. But also, you've taken on the pedagogical piece as well, which is complex, as we know. And how can we use the affordances of technology to support teaching and learning? I've been project lead with Eve's team on Selfie, and I think that's, for me, it's been interesting. We started Selfie as a small pilot a couple of years ago. We wanted to test it in 4 countries. We ended up testing it in 14, and now we've had 500,000 users in a year. And I think, speaking to schools and end users of Selfie, I think the important thing is the school or the university or the training college or the early years education is the unit of change. And I think the top down is important, and the strategies are important, and of course putting investment in infrastructure. But ultimately, if change is going to happen, it will involve the people in the school community, which is the students and the school leaders and the teachers as well. So I'd just be interested to hear your words on that relationship of kind of top down and bottom up and what's needed. And just a last observation, I think demonstration is really important as well to show. I mean, teachers are in the business of teaching and learning, and they need to see, really, they need stories and they need demonstration on how it can help them as a sports teacher, as a maths teacher at senior level, as a history teacher. And I think that's something we need to do more of as well. They hear a lot and they sense the digital technologies can help, but I think the demonstration is vital too.
Yes, bottom up, definitely. Like a bottom up approach is as much as important as the top down. I mean, policy and institutions are the background, but then if you don't get the feedback from the end users are important, then you miss like an important point of view, because after all, they're going to be involved in the change that is delivered. We take this into consideration, maybe looking at educators' skills and capacity to involve the technology. We looked into this in the policy analysis of the European Union actions, and actually we selected few best practices, and one of the recommendation is precisely to keep on going with these bottom-up practices that take into consideration how the change happens in the field, also to take into account the issue that was raised before, that it's not all about the technology, that it's not enough to integrate a computer in a classroom to get the results. So there it's important to get feedback on the experiences of people that live this change, to understand how to integrate better the technology. So, yep.
Hi, my name is Angeliki Dodopoulou. I'm also working for the Unit Skills and Qualification of the European Commission, and also participated in the study in the index. Very interesting report. Actually, I would like to ask, I'm a bit surprised because you're not actually include any data from United Kingdom, right? It's only focused on EU 27? Okay, but it's but for the reasons that we all know, or in general? I mean, it's just because, I mean, practically and theoretically are still part of the EU, but I was a bit surprised on this.
It's basically, we expected the UK to have left already when it started. We were not, we were politically naive, and also it's a little bit budget.
And actually, will it be a second version of this? Are you planning to have continuous, let's say, updates on this index, or?
Sorry.
Yes, as I said, there is definitely interest in the topic and in repeating this calculation and to see how things evolve. So for sure, and actually we consider to, I don't know, include the UK in the future. Stay tuned. I really don't know.
Okay, there was registration. Sorry, I think you were first, actually, if I don't mind.
Sorry.
If the lady there could go first.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Anna Nata. I work for Google in Germany. Just for transparency, I was not involved in this excellent report, although now I wish I had been, of course, because it's very well done. So congratulations on that, first of all. I was, however, in Germany involved in a project that where we released the results on Monday with a trade union Verdi, the German speakers might know this, and 2 chambers of commerce in Bavaria and Düsseldorf, where we also look at sort of similar things about lifelong learning and digital skills, especially in the context of employment. So how can we make sure that people that are in a job right now will have the right adequate skills that they need to still be in their job or excel in their job in, let's say, 5 years' time. And a second aspect of this partnership involved what I think the first person who asked a question about basic skills. We got the feedback from the chambers of commerce who said, well, what about people who have not been in touch, let's say, with digital technologies for years? They might not be ready to take on really specialized skills or like training courses. They really need to be brought closer to digital technology in a very simple way. It's a little bit like if you're a digital, how do you say, analphabet? So if illiterate, that's right. Thank you. So that's why we launched on Monday in German only. It's called the Basic Toolbox, so basisbox.de. So it's a repository of like very short, very basic courses where people who don't have any prior knowledge on certain topics can go and train themselves, like 5 minutes long. So it's really not meant to be anything major, but maybe this is just a sort of introduction to say Germany is coming last. There are some activities though that are trying to counter that. But maybe the question that I would have is the study that Fraunhofer conducted as part of this partnership also looked at obstacles of why people may not do trainings. Like they don't have time, they don't feel like there's any value in doing a training course, or there's nothing specific available. Did you also look at that sort of from a European perspective? What would be different obstacles in different member states? Or is that something that could be interesting for future research?
We did not look at this in this study, but for this we built a bit on the expertise that we have in-house, because we do research on upskilling, reskilling, vocational training, and actually we are running a study on upper reskilling in member states, and we look also at what are the challenges for adults' engagement in lifelong learning. Of course, there are some differences across member states. Time is actually one of the most, is one of the most common challenges everywhere. Lack of adequate supply for relevant training is another one. So not here, but we built a bit on what we have in other research activities.
Code Week, or also digital opportunity traineeships, but we also the people who are behind the DESI index, and we work on Eurostat on the household and the industry survey. And actually, just a few observations from somebody who has also contributed to building a composite index. You know that it always has like pros and cons and weak points and stronger points, and you have of course a number of criteria, and particularly in the second category, B, institutions and policies for digital learning, which are based on experts. And of course, that is also the category which there's a high correlation between basically the outcome in that category and also some of the surprise results, such as Germany, although just as Daniel, I would also support some of the findings as regards this country, specifically out of sympathy. But you know, a composite index is only as good as the information that it gives, and that it gives you also some insights on what are actually the limiting factors and the barriers where you can make some changes. So, for example, we can make certain changes in areas of governance, but we cannot change the federal system of Germany or of Belgium or other things. So, looking to that, I mean, based on your work, what are perhaps some of the areas where we can already you can make some bold recommendations in terms of what should be changed in terms of governance between European level, national level, private, public, to move the needle in the next years?
No, thank you for the question. I'm going to avoid the second one because it's very big. But I'll start with the first one because I think you make a lot of very fair points. And then perhaps my colleague would like to say something about more systemic EU issues, or perhaps Daniel or Maria. Um, you're, you're right to point out that the second pillar, pillar B, how we call this, this is less related to the others. So if you take the first and the third, then there's a pretty strong connection between these two, right? And if you just like do a simple correlation between the two, that is much less strong if you take the second one. Part of this is because it's new data. This is just new data that has not existed before. I think that in the future, one thing that could be done to perhaps strengthen this is to simply use more experts, right? So this is also something that is an inherent weakness of indexes or indices, but it's also standard practice in indices. If you want to look at the ease of doing business index, for example, or other well-known ones, there's literally no way to assess a certain situation without asking an expert in a given area. And so this is also our experience there, or it was just not possible to find data at European level to say how good a primary school teacher in Latvia is. We needed to rely on expertise within the country. So there's, again, we did a lot of work to minimize the amount of subjectivity there. This is discussed more in depth in the methodological note. But of course, what you're also saying is the strength of what we're trying to say is it's contingent on how well we put together the index. While it's not this report that you probably have in your hands, the nice colors on the thing, this does not have the entire methodological note. It does not include all of the robustness checks that we did, all of the statistical wizardry that our economists in-house have done. We did a lot of checks to verify that if we change the weights, if we include a different measure, that we are not substantially changing the outcome. And so we have done our due diligence, is what I'm trying to say here. But as you say, this is, of course, it's very difficult to measure what we try to measure, and so to a certain extent, we must do what other indexes do. We do rely somewhat on expert opinion, but I think that this is justifiable practice in this case.
Systemically. Yeah, I mean, I think that we can point at one overarching word that is cooperation. So of course you don't change a federal state, but cooperating both across member states and within member states at different governance level is important to build economies of scale on a phenomenon like this. Like you really join forces when you have to find the best solutions, and then it's necessary to involve all the actors. We are describing that digital learning is not only about technological development, but it's also about educators, about how schools adapt to change, and affects students significantly. So you need to take into account the voices of all these actors when you develop a process like this. And for this, better cooperation is my quick takeaway.
Yeah, I would just add that it's also cooperation at the level of businesses, right? A lot of the Germany takeaways was also about access to broadband in rural areas, and so there's lots of cooperation to be had with others there besides educator and schools, and businesses need to play their role as well. So I think there's the main takeaway from the report is not only the differences from these countries, but also how different actors in this ecosystem need to work together to implement these policies more than just at a policy level.
Thank you. I'm Karin Astan. I'm a director of EU Policy for Developers Alliance. One aspect that I found very interesting is related to the negative and skepticism against technologies, and I think this has an important impact. Before all the efforts, including funding for fostering digital skills, I think this aspect should be firstly addressed. And also, I wonder if you can comment on this. And also, I wonder if in your research, if you identified that, I understand that that was not necessarily the main objective, but maybe if you identified certain barriers against the public-private partnerships, including of regulatory nature of other types of barriers. Thank you.
I'll briefly address the first question, but maybe Daniel would even want to add to what I have to say there. I agree that it's just fascinating to look at the attitudinal considerations of this, or you might even consider attitudinal barriers towards implementing digital learning change. And so it's very drastic when you look at the average attitude in a place like Finland or Luxembourg or the Netherlands versus, well, Italy, Germany, not to pick on Germany forever, right? But we also we do make country-specific recommendations at the very end in these country sheets, right? One of them in Germany, there's a very clear, and maybe I shouldn't, we have a German here, maybe you could speak more about this, but there's, I think, a pretty clear connection between concerns about privacy and skepticism towards digital technology. This includes things like putting your data in the cloud and maybe being hesitant to pay digitally, these sorts of things. So our recommendation there is that if you're a policymaker who wants to have any chance of success in implementing digital policy, you need to be conscientious of the cultural concerns that you have across the population to work with. I don't have anything to say on public-private partnerships. Maybe my colleagues do, or Daniel would like to speak a bit more about this.
I certainly don't want to speak more about Germany, poor guys. But I think one can observe a certain cultural navel gazing in the larger member countries, right? We have this tradition, we are a big cultural nation. Why it should be changed for all this newfangled digital stuff, which doesn't have any cultural baggage, right? It is not in our whatever German, French, whatever Italian DNA, cultural DNA. And there, I think smaller member countries have an advantage because they know the world won't adapt to us, we have to adapt to the world. And I think that can explain to some extent why some of the smaller member countries, especially the more open ones, economically also, are more ready to embrace the new.
Thank you. I'm Vera dos Santos Costa. I'm at the ETUI. I'm the director of the education department. So our institute is a research and education institute for European Trade Union Confederation. So here a little bit the workers' point of view. We had the students one, which I completely share. The quality and all the aspect of accreditation was completely lost, which I think here, because one of your points is to, and it's why you're here, it's to influence policymakers. This is part of a policy making, is having this quality in mind. So I think this is something, if you really conduct such a research, that some of those, as we can see in some of your recommendations, that you take that into consideration, but we don't see that in the in all the report. Second thing that was a little bit, or I'm going to say a shortcut in the justification of the index was saying that, well, tomorrow we'll have a lot of high-skilled jobs. I'm not sure that digitalization will lead to high-skilled jobs. I'm sure that effectively we will have digitalization assisting a lot of jobs and maybe even not high-skilled jobs. So this is a shortcut for the future of work that I would avoid in such a report. And the last remark is that effectively as I said, the accreditation is very important in a policy, has also the time for people to really enter into this digital world and learning. So when thinking about, and here because we have a high representation of people from the European Commission, who should, we have the digital agenda, we have some policies at EU level, thinking about future policies. We have to cross the different areas. So we have to cross the education with the world of work, and so allow everyone to really assess and access this education. Thank you.
No, thank you for the questions. I'll take a portion of it, and then I think I'm going to pass off to my colleague Sarah once more. We certainly were very concerned with accreditation, and this is things is reflected both at the member state level and at the EU level. And so I'll let Sarah talk more about EU level. This was a specific question that we asked each individual expert: is there an accreditation system that is digitalized within your country? How does that work out? And so we were concerned with this. Every single country, this was asked. It was a part of their overall score. We were also very interested in if they are using new technologies like blockchain. Not to use a hype word, but this is something that could be useful for accreditation. And in fact, Malta was the first country to have an accreditation system using blockchain. The long story short, we were very concerned with this, and we completely respect the importance of this in the overall education picture. And then, of course, in the discussion about EU level, we did also talk about the sort of standardized accreditation technique with the Europass CV and so on. But I think that there's almost two different focuses, right? I mean, to make sure that you have successful policy at the member state level, then this can be a very useful tool. But at the EU level, there's also a very important element, which is the movement of workers. You need to ensure that things are equally accredited across different countries, which is one aspect where the EU has very clear sort of a competence to act. So on the, we certainly weren't concerned with.
Was there a two-hander?
Hmm?
So actually, digital employment is developing the new Europass framework, which is actually want to modernize the current Europass that we all know. And as part of the new Europass is developing an infrastructure for universities to use to issue digital diplomas. And in parallel is developing an accreditation database where they will store information on the accreditation status of all universities in Europe and store it in blockchain, in public blockchain, more specifically in Ethereum, so that actually an employer or other institutions can verify the accreditation status of universities in real time. And this will be, it's actually an ongoing project, and it will release in April 2020, so in a couple of months of now. At the moment, it's focusing on higher education and universities, but the plan is that this infrastructure is also used by vendors or by other institutions, training institutions, and so on. But the information on the accreditation database will only mainly come from the national qualification databases that each member state has.
No, that's fine. Thanks. So actually, I'll pat on the question of can we really expect to see massive growth in high skilled jobs, which was asserted early on in the presentation. I'll pass off to Maria, and then on the E-level accreditation, if Sarah wanted to speak about this, then she's better qualified than me to answer that question. So I'll pass off.
Great, thanks. So we're actually doing some research on the future of work in Europe, and we're looking at some of the occupations that are growing, some of the occupations that are declining. And we actually see that there's occupations that are growing in fields such as healthcare or creative arts, events that don't require higher levels of education. So we do see the high STEM occupations growing, but there's also a positive story for occupations that normally don't require higher education. So I think the challenge is, or the opportunity is to identify how can we provide certifications, as Angeliki and Zach was just saying, that are easy to access, more focused. So there's a lot of conversation around micro degrees and how we can facilitate that from a technology perspective, but also with other partners. So the challenge is more for the middle skilled jobs in this sense. That's the kind of the category that's being a bit more pressure, especially in sectors like manufacturing, which are quite significant in Germany as well, in Italy. So so there's loads of challenges, but there's also lots of opportunities for different occupations.
Yeah, just a clarification. This is a long-standing misunderstanding when we talk about skills and qualifications. I mean, if you are employed in healthcare and you do a very precise or very careful work, you are not high qualified, but you are highly skilled. So in this sense, even if and this is the job polarization of the labor market argument, that the jobs that will be created will be at the two ends of the qualification spectrum, no? So the low qualified and the high qualified. So high skilled work will increase in the sense that more and more skills will be required, not necessarily linked to an existing qualification. So this is one point. Then why then high-level qualification is important, high-level education is important? Well, for the other two reasons, because we need to keep learning, and when you are low educated, you have lower chances to keep learning during life, or at least to engage in further adult learning activities. So I think that you are right. Like this was a shortcut, but the argument is much more complex than this. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, and the final question here.
Good afternoon. I'm Roberto Musmeci. I work at SEPS. Just a short question, because some of the maps that I see in the report can be really almost overlap with the level of digitalization of public administration in the countries. I was wondering whether Google has some initiative with the governments in improving their ability and their digital level in all the sector, also beyond digital learning. I see, for instance, Denmark has a government technology program. Not all the country, for instance, have it. Estonia has a very high level. I was wondering whether Google is indeed helping, or does it aim at having some initiative on this?
So the question being if we have programs specifically to help governmental institutions to upskill. So the majority of our initiatives are focused either in specific industries, as I mentioned. So for example, in Italy, focusing a lot on the manufacturing sectors. We do partner with the government, but not necessarily to upskill the government. But it is an area that we're, willing to look at. We have the content, and we're always looking for more opportunities across the EU. But normally our partnerships focus more on trying to help drive economic growth through specific sectors, such as SMEs or specific individuals in challenged areas, as I mentioned, rural areas or others. But we're always looking to explore more.
Thank you.
I think this was the best final word. Thanks a lot for your interest. I think my takeaway of today is that there's a lot of interest in such an index and in the issue itself. And of course, there's also a number of open issues which we might want to address in the future, as Zach said, so watch this space. Thank you very much.